Good morning everybody, Mr. R here again. Time for another story time. Another story from my box. And I hope you're all safe and well. I've been looking forward to doing another story with you, and I'm going to do this story in two parts. So the first part is now, and then the second part is going to be next week. Again, this is a very old story. One of the stories from my box that I had trouble reading at first because lots of the print, lots of the writing was beginning to fade on the page, and I had to do quite a lot of work to make sure that the pages didn't fall apart when I read this story. This story happened well over 100 years ago, and it's about a boat called the Olympic. And the Olympic was built around about the same time as the Titanic, which a lot of you I'm sure will know sunk on its voyage from England to America. An Olympic was also one of the luxury liners. A liner is another word for a ship that would sail across the Atlantic Ocean from London to New York. And in those days you had to be very, very rich, very wealthy to afford a ticket, to be able to pay for a ticket to go on one of these liners, like the Olympic or the Titanic. So you had to have a lot of money. And the journey, the voyage, was quite a long one. So most of the people that came onto these luxury liners would come with a huge trunk of clothes, full of clothes and things that they would need for the voyage. And like I said, they were very wealthy people. There were lots of cabins on the boat, so if you were lucky enough to be able to go on one of these voyages, you would have your own cabin. And these cabins were really luxurious. That means that they were they had everything you could ever need. They had lovely soft beds and beautiful silk sheets and thick carpets, and they all had a view of the ocean as you were sailing across. You were looked after really well, so if there was anything that you wanted on the liner, there was somebody there to help you. And the crew of the boat, the people who looked after you, all basically dressed the same. They had beautiful white uniforms with gold buttons and white pants and shoes, and they all had hats on their head, and they were all very polite and happy to help you if you needed something. Now, right at the very bottom of the liner was built in different stages. So the top of the boat was really for the passengers. The very, very top of the boat was where the captain would be with his officers, so that he had a good view of the sea ahead. But right at the very bottom of the boat was the engine room. And this is where a lot of the story that I'm going to tell you about takes place. Because in the engine room, there was a huge oven. Now, we're talking about an oven that was the size of a small room. And coal, which is like a crumbly black rock, was the fuel that was put into the oven. And the heat that was made in the oven was the heat that would drive the propellers round, which would move the boat through the water. So this oven had to be kept hot for the whole voyage. And so in the engine room was a huge pile of coal, and workers in the engine room would shovel the coal into the oven to make the heat. And they had to do this for the whole voyage, otherwise the propellers would stop and the boat would stop moving through the water. So day and night, men with shovels would shovel coal into this huge oven. And it was a really tough job. There were quite a few people down in the engine room that would do this, and they would do it in 2 shifts. So a shift is how long you worked. The first shift would work for the day, and the second shift would work at night. And if you weren't working, you could relax and sleep in your bunk bed. There were bunk beds down there for the workers, or you could make yourself something to eat in the kitchen. Now these workers were not allowed out of the engine room, and the reason for that is a sad one really. It's because these workers were always dirty. Not only were they always working, but they were always covered in coal dust. Because if you were shoveling coal into the oven for 12 hours, you were covered in black soot. So your hair and your face and your clothes and your hands and your fingernails, the coal dust got everywhere. Not very healthy. And if you weren't working, you were too tired to start moving around too much. So right at the back of the engine room was where everybody slept, and they would take it in turns to sleep in their bunk beds, or get up, like I say, and have something to eat in the kitchen they had down there too. These workers were not allowed in the rest of the ship, so they weren't allowed out of the engine room. And the reason for that is because all of the passengers in the rest of the boat, who were walking around in their beautiful clothes on beautiful soft carpets, they didn't want to be talking to the people in the engine room that were covered in coal dust that would make the whole ship dirty. Not even the officers on the boat in their beautiful white uniforms would go down to the engine room very much, because if they went down, you could imagine all of the coal dust that would come out of the room and cover their white uniforms and make them dirty. So even if they did go down there, and like I said, that didn't happen very often, they would make sure that they stood at the door of the engine room and not go too far inside where it got dirtier the closer you got to these huge ovens. Now when these luxury liners, when the Olympic eventually arrived in New York, the workers in the engine room weren't even allowed off the boat then. They had to stay where they were and wait for the boat to turn around, which would normally be 2 or 3 days later, and then make the journey back to England. So it was a very, very hard time for these workers, and you had to be really tough. You had to be very strong. You had to have big muscles. You had to have a strong back, because of course you were working with a heavy shovel and coal for a long time. Now one of these workers down in the engine room was called Lester, and Lester was a black man. He was extremely strong and everybody liked him. He was the most popular worker in the engine room. He was very kind, first of all. He was great fun to be with. He was always making jokes and making everybody laugh, and he always seemed to be happy. And in a way, he was kind of the leader in the engine room. He knew how everything worked. So people looked up to him for advice. So people would ask him questions, and if Lester was unhappy, other people would be unhappy in the engine room too. So he was kind of somebody who would look after everybody else. And Lester had been doing this job for a long time, and people would often ask him questions if they were new, for instance, in the engine room, about how long he had to work for, what other jobs had to be done, where they were going to sleep in the bunk room, questions like this. But Lester had a secret that nobody else knew, and it's this secret that really starts this story off. Because when the boat eventually arrived in New York and everybody got off the boat, all of the passengers and all of the officers would leave the boat. The officers would have 2 or 3 days in New York to look around and explore, and like I said, the workers in the engine room had to stay where they were. But once the boat was safely docked in New York, Lester would find a time to leave the engine room. normally at night time when his friends and workers were asleep and resting. And you could imagine if you've been shoveling coal for days and days and days while this boat is going across the Atlantic Ocean, you're going to need a rest. So Lester always had time to leave the engine room, and he would quietly slip out of the engine room and go upstairs. And like I said to you before, upstairs was where all the passengers were. Of course, there were no passengers now because they were all off the boat. And Lester would start in the cabins, and he would start walking into all of the cabins looking for things that had been left behind. And it was amazing what he would find. He would find things under the bed, he would find things that had been left on the dresser, he would find things hidden in the thick carpet, and he would put them in his pocket. And he would go from one cabin to the next, looking for things that had been left behind, and he would keep them. And back down in the engine room he had a box that was very well hidden, and he would put the things that he'd found inside the box. Now once he'd visited all of the cabins where all of the passengers slept, he would go into the banquet hall. Now the banquet hall is another word for a dining room where everybody would eat. And if you were a passenger on one of these boats, this was where you would go in the evening for your meals. And it was a huge, big room right at the front of the boat. It had a big piano in one corner, and a pianist, somebody who plays a piano, would play gentle music while you ate your food. Very often the officers of the boat would join the passengers for something to eat too, and there were huge tables, long tables, all the way down one end and then back down the other end, and like I say, a small area at the front where there was a big piano and where other people could play musical instruments like violins and cellos. And Lester went into the banquet room. Now here he had to be very careful because there were always one or two officers left on the boat, and if one of them came into the banquet room he would be seen very easily, so he couldn't just walk around looking for things. What he did was he went underneath one of the tables, and on the tables were long white tablecloths that hung all the way down to the ground, and he would crawl underneath the table looking for things that people had dropped. And again, just like in the cabins, it was amazing what he could find. If he was lucky he'd find a coin or two, but he'd also found watches and jewellery and lighters and all sorts of things that he could sell later when he arrived back in England. So once he'd crawled all the way along underneath one of these long tables, he would stand up and move on to the second table and crawl all the way back again. And if somebody had come into the room, which nobody ever had, then it would be easy for him just to keep super quiet and not be seen. Now, it was on one of the voyages that something very strange happened. Lester had crawled all the way down to the end of the room underneath one table, and he was crawling back underneath the second table when he heard a noise, and he immediately stopped and he listened, and this noise sounded like someone crying. And he listened for a little bit longer, and he was sure that it was a child crying. So he lifted up the edge of the tablecloth and he looked around, and there on top of the piano was not a child as such, but a baby. A baby had been left on top of the piano, and the baby was crying. The baby was wrapped up in a white blanket, and Lester didn't know what to do. The first thing he did was he put the tablecloth back over his head again, and he waited for somebody to come and collect the baby. But after quite a while, when nobody came, the baby was at this time crying even louder, and when Lester looked again, the baby had rolled over to the edge of the piano. And Lester saw what was going to happen. If the baby rolled over once more, the baby would have fallen from the piano. And Lester didn't think that he had any choice. He had to go and stop the baby from falling. So he came out of his hiding place, he looked around very quickly, and he went over to the piano and he picked the baby up. And as soon as he picked the baby up, the baby stopped crying. Lester didn't think that he could put the baby back onto the piano again. This baby had been left there by someone, and he took the baby underneath the table. And he crawled underneath the table, finishing what he was doing, looking at the rest of the carpet, holding the baby in one hand. And when he'd finished and his pockets were full of the things he'd found in the cabins and under the tables, he went down to the engine room, still carrying the baby. Now, when he got into the engine room and he walked into the bedroom, we call it, where everybody slept, everybody stopped what they were doing and looked at Lester, because he was carrying a baby. And they said to him, Lester, where did you find a baby? Now, most of the people secretly knew what Lester did when the boat arrived in New York. So nobody was too surprised that he'd been in the rest of the boat, but they were very surprised that he'd come back with a baby. Lester looked down at the sleeping boy and said, I found the baby asleep on top of the piano, and I don't know what to do with him. And then everybody started talking. You have to take him back, Lester. But we can't look after him here, and he doesn't belong here. He belongs to one of the passengers. Somebody's sure to come back and go and look for the baby. Why don't you go back up and leave him on the piano again? And it wasn't long before everybody was arguing. Everybody had an opinion. Everybody thought that they knew what was best. And in the end, Lester shouted, "Everybody stop," he said. "I make the decisions in the engine room, and I've decided what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do. We are going to keep the baby." And everybody was shocked. Nobody thought that Lester was going to decide to keep the baby. And one or two people started saying to Lester things like, how are we going to feed the baby? Who's going to look after the baby? But Lester had an answer for everything. Well, we always have milk down here, he said. That won't be a problem. And we're all clever people down here. I'm sure we can find a way of making a bottle. We don't all work at the same time. Some of us are asleep while others are working. So the baby will all be looked after. The baby can sleep in my bunk bed. I've decided. I've even decided on a name for the baby. The baby is going to be called Simon. And that's exactly what happened. Simon started living in the engine room. And it wasn't long before everybody in the engine room came to love this little baby. And they didn't have fights, but they all wanted to look after him so much that they would often argue about who was going to look after Simon. And Simon started growing up. And the Olympic went back and forward on its voyage from London to New York, and a year went by, and 2 years went by, and 3 years went by, and now Simon was a toddler, and he was toddling everywhere. He wanted to get into everything. He would be crawling around the floor in the bunk room, or he would be in the kitchen. He wasn't allowed near the ovens, of course, because there it was way too hot. And everybody wanted, like I say, to look after him and play with him. And lots of the workers built him toys, for instance, that he could play with. And he would sit for hours on Lester's bed playing with a new toy that had been made for him. Now one day, Lester was working. And as usual, he was doing the work of 3 people. With his huge, big, heavy shovel, He was shoveling coal into the huge ovens as the boat sailed across the Atlantic. And then suddenly there was a huge hissing noise and a burst of steam from one of the pipes high up in the engine room. One of the huge big nuts on this pipe had come loose and steam was coming out of it. And straight away Lester knew that it needed to be tightened, otherwise eventually it would break off completely. But it meant climbing right up to the top of the engine room with a spanner to tighten the nut. And Lester volunteered to do it before anybody else could say anything. And he put a spanner, a huge big spanner to tighten a bolt, in his pocket, and he started climbing up one of the ladders to tighten the bolt. Now, to tighten this bolt, he also had to move across the top because this pipe had broken right in the middle of the engine room, which meant he had to be very, very careful because it was a long way down. And he managed to get to the pipe, and he took the spanner out of his pocket and started tightening the bolt. And eventually he got it nice and tight, but at the last moment the spanner slipped on the bolt and Lester lost his grip and he fell. Now, he fell a long way. Like I told you before, this pipe was a long way up, and Lester fell really awkwardly and he broke his leg quite badly. He was very sick. He had some other injuries too, which they didn't really talk about in the story. But Lester clearly couldn't work anymore, and so he was put to bed and looked after. And when the boat arrived in New York, Lester was taken off the boat. Simon, the baby, was still on the boat, but Lester was taken off the boat to recover from his injuries. And this is a bit of a strange part of the story because it wasn't talked about what happened to Lester after that. We do know that Lester never again worked on the boat. He never came back to the engine room. Now, what we don't know is whether Lester recovered from his injuries. We know that his leg break, his broken leg, was very bad. It was broken in lots of places, so maybe he had trouble walking again and probably wasn't ever able to work in the engine room again. So Lester stayed in New York, and what happened to him after that, like I said, I'm not sure. But Simon stayed in the engine room, and that is where I'm going to stop the story, because we are almost in the middle of the story and I'm going to tell you the second part next week. So stay safe and look after yourselves, and we will finish this story next week.